Written culture is declining more rapidly than we might have expected. And with that, all these European Enlightenment foundations dwindle as well. But I think there's still opportunity.
You and Dwarkesh both say that AI has kind of John Stuart Mill's Enlightenment values.
It does. It's great. It's the last bastion. You know, the beast of the machine is where it remains so strong. Typically, it's a moderating influence, and it will remind you of reality and give you pretty objective answers. So that's one of my hopes, that the soft power of the main AI systems goes up somewhat. I think it will.
Tyler Cowen, welcome to the Hope Axis. This is already my favorite episode, and I feel that this is going to be very unfair to the other people who are trying to come on this podcast. How can we make this episode or this podcast with this episode better for the future? How are we going to lay some good groundwork for those coming later on?
Ask me what you want to ask, right? That's the best start.
It's so interesting because I think this idea, which was very spontaneous, I believe 2 days ago, came out of the fact that I had this long hoped for topic that I wanted to discuss with you if the opportunity arose that you would come on the Hope Axis, which was to talk a little bit about your autobiographical pieces, which I really am enjoying. I think I told you that I feel like this is a kind of revival of the gonzo. Nobody expects somebody like you running away from people with machetes or going into the jungle to buy some very obscure piece of art that, of course, you know about, and then we'll write a book about. And I feel that's great. And I thought, okay, bummer, this person now stole my idea, Josh Rosen. And I had a very complicated sort of feelings about it because on the one hand, I was kind of pissed off that, okay, my idea was stolen. On the other hand, the episode is marvelous. I'm so happy and I want everybody to listen to it. So we will definitely include it in the description. But then also made me think, okay, why did I want to talk about this in the first place? What is it about the autobiographical pieces that personally interests me? And it seems to me that what fascinates me about them is that's the nail and I'm the hammer here. It seems to me that you're always trying to figure out the inside and the outside of a situation. Are you, to what degree are you an outsider in Mexico? And when do you become accepted in the village? All your books are about talent. Basically, we can read even Discover Your Inner Economist as a piece where we are invited to cultivate better talents and like how to get good food. Obviously, the book Talent is about talent, but so is Goat, for instance. And so last night I read Goat and I was shocked to find out the actual origin of my interest in this, which is this image at the beginning where you are somehow stalking Gottfried Haberner from the outside of his home and he is inside eating soup. And I thought, well, that is my image. That is looking from the outside to the inside, but there's also insight there. And then to my surprise, I remembered that, you were also stalking in a similar fashion Friedrich Hayek later on, similarly from the outside of his home. And then this image just kind of stuck with me. Right now, Tyler, at the height of your career, in this beautiful moment, do you feel inside or outside? Where are you? Where are you on the spectrum?
I think always outside. So when I went to see Habeler, I was quite young. I would guess I was 18, maybe 19, and he lived in Washington, D.C., and he was this famous economist. So it seemed obvious to me you would want to drive by and see his home. There was no intent on bothering him in any way. But you look at the window and you see this guy's head sort of drooping, and he's doing something like eating soup. And it's like, hey, I saw Gottfried Habeler. That was a thrill. I think it's a good indicator of talent if you ask people, like the people you thought were really important, before you were 25 years old, did you actually get to meet them?
Yeah.
And if the person has made no progress on that, I think it's a very bad sign that they're not out there questing after something. Even if you just go and hear their talk or, shake Peter Thiel's hand or whatever. So, by age 25, you should really be trying to meet people in a pretty significant way. And driving by Habeler's home was one of my ways of doing that.
And you
lived in
discovered
Northwest,
all
a very
Eastern
nice
Europeans do
neighborhood.
at home.
And he lived to age 95, I think, if I remember correctly. So it was a long connection back to a lot of earlier history of economics just to see him.
And you discovered what all Central Europeans do at home. in the privacy when they don't know that Tyler Cowen is watching them from the outside. We eat soup. I just had soup, so I was laughing so much at that part. Of course, that's what he was doing. I'm sorry that with Hayek you were less lucky. It seems like he didn't show himself.
Well, I met Hayek when he gave a talk at George Mason in 1984 or maybe 1983, and that was excellent. But when I lived in Freiburg and Hayek lived in Freiburg, he was just very sick. And, pretty soon he would pass away. So I never saw him in Freiburg, but the dorm I lived in was pretty close to his house. But I never saw him drinking soup.
And you also saw Ayn Rand. I remember you telling me about that.
She
It's
gave a talk in New York City, one of her last talks. It wasn't very good, I'm sorry to say, but still, just to see the whole event and the people who were there, it was crazy. It did feel like a cult, and you read like, oh, objectivism was a cult. Maybe you nod your head, but when you see it in front of your eyes, it's something really quite different.
and you kind of have to go there. I think this is what I'm taking away so far from both the autobiographical elements in your books and these kind of outright autobiographical pieces that you are now writing for the AIs, is there's always this crossing of a threshold, right? And every piece is about like stepping across something, whether that's traveling or getting access to somebody that you didn't before. And I always marvel at that ability. And I think you people who know me know this about me, that I always wonder what makes people cross that.
I think when you're young, going to events is quite underrated. They can change your life. Maybe when you're older, you're invited to many things. Going to events is quite overrated. They're more likely to be just a waste of time. But to send people to events is a very noble thing.
I was sent to your unconference, so I can attest to that. um, yeah, I mean, I come from a very small place where, crossing these boundaries was much more about the subjective perception of the world, was much more a hallucination, because you basically go to the same supermarket as the prime minister. There's no
This
physical.
is Budapest, right?
This is Budapest, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it becomes a completely different kind of arena when it's international and when it's online. I mean, I just moved here. I moved to America a little bit over a year ago, and it did feel like crossing this giant or like passing this giant obstacle. And then you find out that there are many other little ways of inside and outside thinking and acting. I reread this morning Talent, and this is what I feel like you and Danielle are kind of getting at this in many different ways, asking people about their childhood experiences or how ambitious they are. I never remember whether that was you or Shruti Rajagopalan, your collaborator who and head of EV India, who said this thing that I so often think about, that your resilience is proportionate to the size of your belief system. But I think crossing the thresholds or widening what inside and outside is also that, like, how big do you think the world is? When did you start seeing the world as so big?
Well, when I was young, I didn't travel very much. I grew up in New Jersey. I would go quite often to New York City. My first trip overseas was to London and Oxford. I was 17, but it didn't actually addict me to travel. It was living in Germany a few years later that did it. And yeah, there's just a thrill, that first moment of crossing some threshold and seeing something new. And you want to keep on doing that again. But it becomes a puzzle of sorts. How do you keep the threshold equally exciting? You've been to more places, been surprised in all sorts of different ways. And, what do you do next that counts as that? I'm not sure anyone solves that problem entirely.
I mean, one way of keeping it interesting is, first of all, it seems to me that to think that interestingness is a little bit inherent. And although there are some half-hearted attempts at giving people tips of how to become more interesting, it seems to me that you do think that that's something that people kind of arrive with as part of the whole package.
Probably you're born with it. And you can go to the town next door and it can feel quite different. You can learn a lot. I call this local tourism. I think it's important to go around the area where you live and make what are geographically very small trips, but turn it into something quite different and surprising. And for almost anywhere you live, this is quite possible. Certainly where you are in New York City, but even in Northern Virginia, you can drive less than half an hour, or you can drive maybe 80 minutes and be in the state of West Virginia. There's so many options.
Wow. I mean, I think I only realized how little I knew about Hungary when I went to university at 18, because we had traveled. I was like upper middle class, very successful parents. I was in Spain when I was in my mother's belly swimming in the sea. Like there were no the typical kind of enclosure of the East Bloc was entirely absent. But as a result, we never really went to the country, or like we only went to see relatives or something. And I remember going to university at 18 and meeting these other young women who were wearing the same clothes as I was, and they didn't have an accent, but they didn't know where Astoria was in Budapest. And I was like, but isn't Budapest the center of the world? Like, how can you not know one of the biggest metro stations in the city? And they were walking around, it's 2002. They were walking around with maps. And I was like, okay, I have to change my mindset a little bit and just look around myself. Do you feel that Americans are becoming less interested in their immediate environment?
They take their immediate environment for granted, but they travel abroad at much, much higher rates. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but if you look at the time series on what percentage of Americans have a passport, it's
Mm.
impressive how rapidly it's grown. Uh, one of my trips to Hungary, I drove over from Austria. It was just a day trip, and I went to see only one town on the border with Austria.
Sopron?
Uh, I don't remember. It wasn't a big place, but it was fantastic just
With a
to
family?
cross the border and see that the homes were totally different, and there were all these greens and the yards looked different, and there was absolutely nothing to do there, but it was still thrilling. In a way, it was more interesting than my last trip to Budapest.
When was your last trip to Budapest?
I don't know, maybe a dozen years ago. My first trip to Budapest, I loved. That was right after things changed. And the second one, it felt very touristy and designed for well-to-do and or drunk tourists, and a lot of rip-offs, and the food was much worse. Uh, so I don't know if I'll go back again because the first trip was so wonderful.
You have to come when I'm there, and then we will see what I remember from the 15 years ago. I think there are some landmarks are still there. This is yeah, it's. I mean, we could do a separate episode about Europe. Obviously, I have a lot of thoughts about that. But it's a very interesting. We're building
Now
this.
yeah,
Sorry, go.
but you have this other tourist demand. People who think Hungary is somehow what Western civilization ought to be, and they go for these weird reasons. And then they're surprised when they turn up. And in a way, it's a bit, not a dump, but it's not impressive, right? In terms of wealth or the ethical standards of the people. It's just another place. And okay, there's fewer immigrants of some certain sort, but it's not a very successful country.
Mhm.
And that's become this other politicized application of the trip to Hungary. So maybe it's just a bad time to go there now. That would be my guess.
Great friend of mine, poet and playwright János Tirei has a play called Protocol about this very sneaky political aide who rises in the ranks of the Hungarian political system and then gets kind of messed with in many other ways. And there's this stanza it's a verse poem, and there's a stanza that says, "Oh Budapest, your beauty is secondary. It always depends where you're flying in from. After Paris, it's a dump. After Baku, it's great." And I often think about it. I mean, Eastern Europe itself is obviously this other liminal space, right? Both inside and outside, you're constantly kind of vacillating on this thin line. You never know, like, am I European? Am I Western? Who sees you as what? And it kind of stays with you even more strongly, I think, when you become an immigrant. People don't fully understand where you're from, or if they do, they have, as you said, extremely weird ideas about how you might represent the end of the fertility crisis or the return of the rule of Christ to Earth.
The most interesting Eastern European places now, I think, are the ones that are quite neglected. So I went to Wrocław in Poland,
Oh,
and
I
no one is
love
really
Wrocław. They
there.
have the best theater festival.
Well, I
In
don't even know about that. It was not on when I was there, but you just feel like you're in some world of its own. I went to North Macedonia. Hardly anyone from the outside was there. It felt like a world unto itself.
yeah.
And it's definitely not Western Europe, but it is still sort of the West. and it's not too trampled upon. But Prague, Budapest, the last times I've gone to each, I was disappointed.
Well,
I went to Kosovo the year before. That was fantastic. 3 days there. I loved it.
and
I
then,
don't think I saw one like American or Western European tourist the whole time. Not even an aid worker. Not that was obviously the case.
yeah. Yeah. Well, if anybody's listening, watching this section of our podcast, please go there. Not because we want to mess up the purity of the place, but you might get these really authentic experiences. You talk about these liminal locations when you discuss talent. And I think maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that's more recent in your thinking. One thing that my friends frequently talk about is that you're obsessed with one of the Toronto suburbs, and you think that it's somehow the crucible of the great intellectual and scientific and cultural talents of the world. Is that true? And should we go there, or should we recruit from there? What's the deal with Toronto or similar suburbs?
Well, Mississauga, Brampton, also Scarborough have remarkable talent, young talent. It's typically the children of immigrants, and they couldn't quite afford to live in Toronto. So I had a call earlier today to an Emergent Ventures winner from Mississauga, which I think is now about 400,000 people. It's not so tiny a place. These towns have incredible food, and they're very overlooked. No one talks about them. The most talented people end up moving to the United States, of course, and it's like a farm system. It enables the U.S. to have a not so great immigration policy, and they can try out in Canada and then work their way over here. And it's been great for us.
I've never been. One of my closest collaborators is Canadian, and this is not even my bucket list. This is the one item on my to-do list is that I have to go to Canada and look around.
Oh, you must go. Like go to Nova Scotia, go to Newfoundland,
Yeah.
Quebec. It's incredible. Way underrated by people in the U.S., I think.
Even though we get
Vancouver is
much of their
beautiful in the traditional way. I quite like Nova Scotia. There's just so many different parts you can visit.
Hmm.
Alberta is fun. And
But
it puts the United States in a whole different light, right? It's like going to Brazil. Two extremes in different directions. If you've seen Brazil and Canada, you understand this country much better because those are, in a way, alternate histories. You can't really say that about Mexico, but Brazil and Canada, you can.
and what went better here? What was the one moment that decided that we wouldn't be Brazil or Canada?
Well, when it comes to Canada, after the Revolution and during the War of 1812, and even right after the Civil War, there was talk of the United States taking what we now call Canada. It was not then the same Canada that it is today. And it almost happened. Now, the U.S. didn't fight very well in the War of 1812, but it could have happened. Uh, but it never did. So, Trump now has these fantasies, but the histories have never been that far apart. And in the late 19th century, Canada is very concerned about building out the Canadian railway system, which is going to go horizontal, partly as a means of stopping their absorption into the United States. So it's been this huge theme for a long time. And, Newfoundland originally was not part of Canada at all. I think that dates from 1949, which is recent. So you can also imagine alternate histories where Quebec is independent at some earlier point, and then the Maritimes attach themselves, to Maine and the United States. It's not a far-fetched alternate history. Obviously, it didn't happen.
We just had a Tim Marshall on Interact because the Prisoners of Geography was 10 years old and there was an anniversary edition. And I mean, fans of the book will love the part about the US that argues that this is the best real estate in the world and it's only really valuable as a whole when you get the, sea borders and the friendly neighbors. And there is this excessive section about how good a piece of news is that the US has so many friendly neighbors, Mexico, Canada, and it was exactly on the same day. I think this alone was listed when the Trump news came out, and you offered the best take, which is that the reason why he chose these countries is because people don't know Burundi, and so it's less fun to go into war with them.
Yeah, Brazil, almost an equally large country as the continental U.S. It had slavery later, a much greater number of slaves, obviously a different mix of immigrants, many more Portuguese, and more commodities rich in some ways, and never built the infrastructure that the US did, never had a comparable system of rivers to knit the nation together. So the different Brazilian states never have identified with each other the way the parts of the US have. And like people even in Rio or Sao Paulo, it's quite common they've never been to the other city, even though a lot of outsiders would have been to both. So Brazil's this very strange country that's, in a way, I wouldn't say it's only barely a country, but it's not very unified, infrastructure way underdeveloped, and again, different mix of groups.
Hmm.
So it feels and indeed is more violent, more freewheeling, much warmer culture. Uh, but the notion of you can just step into Brazil and feel like a Brazilian, it shares that with the United States. In some ways, it might even do a somewhat better job than the US does of that.
It's interesting to me how, I mean, I come from a relatively low trust society, obviously not comparable in terms of like crime rates and other forms of chaos to Brazil. But when we think about like crossing thresholds or like going from state A to state B because whatever is driving you in your personality that might be mysterious or might be nurture nature, we don't know. We often think that that's terrible news that often leads to crime, that leads to some form of exploitation against somebody. And people become quite cocky about it, right? Like the way to signal, I don't know, for a young Hungarian male when I was growing up, that, you know, he is fit in the evolutionary sense would be to kind of cross these thresholds of decency and start doing some really bad things against other people as a way of gaining favors from a certain group. But I feel like, at least, I mean, what I know about American society, having been here so much in the past 6 years and basically working with Americans all day, writing for Americans, hosting for Americans, building to a large degree to Americans, is that it's very different here. Like what the thresholds that people want to kind of, if not cross, but at least approach, are the ones that you, I think, are kind of trying to get at in these new autobiographical pieces, which are self-creation thresholds, right? Like I noticed this opportunity and I crossed, and then I became a different person. Maybe more, I know nothing about gaming, but I'm sure somebody who plays a lot of video games, Elon Musk, would see that this is like going up a level, or I don't even know the right metaphor. Does that even make sense to create this dichotomy between US and the rest? Because there seems to be something very unique about how people see transformation here, at least self-transformation.
I think that's true. It was different in earlier decades. So in the 1970s, to use bad behavior as a way of signaling something about yourself was much more common than it is today. So you could say people today are wimpier, but they're wimpier in a good way. But just the kind of role, say, that Jack Nicholson would play in his early movies resonated with Americans in a way that you could never get away with now. It would just be
Rebel.
distasteful. Rebel in a somewhat obnoxious way, picking on other people. It's been an amazing shift, even just over the last 50 years.
Yeah, 5 easy pieces would not fly today. That would not get a green light from Netflix.
Or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who you're supposed to sympathize with and when. Again, would not work today.
Yeah.
Nurse Ratched would be more popular.
Oh my God, what an idea. I recently rewatched it and I was more curious about the Indian and whether people would understand in our sedated era that it's not good to live without a brain.
Yes, but on the other side, you have movies from the late 60s, set 1970s. So many of them are about freedom, like Ballad of Easy Rider, also Cuckoo's Nest. May or may not be good notions of freedom, but they're about freedom pretty consistently.
Yeah.
And that's vanished almost entirely.
This is stuff I grew up on. Maybe that's why I'm so weird. I'm like, just take it for granted. There must be some freedom somewhere. We can find it. But it's kind of unsavory. Yeah. And I think in a lot of these movies, there is some form of exploitation. I think maybe One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is an exception because the liberation there, at least during that one night of access that they get, I mean, in very serious trouble for later on, everybody gets some, right? I mean, that's the whole point. That it's a party for everybody and a party for people who had never been invited to parties before. and then
And today you're just thinking, well, anyone who escapes, they'll end up as a homeless person. And it's not so romantic, to throw that sink through the window and then jump through and have your quote unquote freedom. Uh, I think in a lot of ways I prefer the earlier worldview, but it's tough to actually live with it as well.
to be a rebel without a cause. Maybe we have too much cause. You can't be a rebel without a cause in 2025. You have too many causes.
But people don't rebel that much today. So, we're now in our second version of the Trump administration. Whatever you think of it, a lot of people obviously hate it, dread it, whatever, and they just don't protest.
Really?
And that to me is repeatedly a big surprise.
If I think about this good habits of Americans, and I think it's there so beautifully in your writing, of going from less free to free along some dimension. And basically in talent, it keeps coming up, right? Like all the decisions are about, is this person going to create some form of abundance in the organization if we add them to it, both internally in themselves, like they will have a good time, they will have fun, et cetera, but also collectively, right? Like I think you or Danielle are quoting that, the IQ of a nation is more important than the IQ of one person. And to me, there is some kind of social contract around that. And when I think about the Trump era, I'm thinking maybe this whole like inside outside category, maybe the whole thing is kind of up for renegotiation, and that would mean that the social contract is, no? Like
I don't know who the insiders are anymore. It
exactly.
used to be clear. People who ran network news shows, worked for the New York Times, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, maybe somewhat still, but I don't know. It all seems to be slipping away. And what actually is replacing it, we've yet to see.
And has it changed things for you?
Well, it's opened up a lot of opportunity for me personally, which is good for me, but I'm not sure it's good for the world. Maybe people like me, in a sense, shouldn't have that much opportunity because it means elites have less of a stranglehold on discourse. And you might prefer that the elites receive more deference than is currently the case, or the former elites, perhaps I should call them. So the fact that it elevates me, well, of course, I'm going to favor that, but it may not make up for, the other idiots who are elevated. And a lot of them are just dopes, right?
What changed?
Well, the stock answer is the internet, and that's clearly a big part of it, but it has to run much deeper than that. And I think some of it was underway before the internet. And these earlier eras, like they have their natural ends with or without the internet. So more and more, I think of the internet as accelerating the end of that older regime, but maybe less of a fundamental cause than I had thought. I don't know. I think it's maybe the big mystery of our time.
Yeah.
What did change?
I mean, in some sense, talent is a little bit outdated, right? I mean, it still is written in this glorious, hopeful era where the internet is liberating us, right? At least talent or access to capital, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that at least the past year, we're seeing the very best thing about that can be hijacked after all, right?
Yes, but it does actually liberate the talent. So Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, the list goes on and on. Patrick Collison, these people make it because of the internet. They make it in very meritocratic ways. So we have that benefit. The notion that people, China, India, wherever, can learn so much because of the internet, that's obviously and clearly true. So I'm still inclined to take the trade-off. But what gets reconstituted from that? Again, I think we still don't know, and it's a little scary because we're not used to not knowing. We're coming out of this very stable period of American history. You could even say Western history. And now it's not that stable anymore.
Yeah, that's how I'm feeling about it as well, that you have these pillars that make certain things possible, and then the very thing that is created on those foundations will come and undo the foundations. And we have seen this a few times in history. A lot of people who are today calling for illiberalism are creatures of liberal liberties. I mean, there's no better way of putting that. It's kind of a strange loop.
And I think some of the effects of the internet, they're quite indirect. So because you can manage things at a distance, You can have much more happening in China that's integrated with the global economy. Again, clearly that's good for China and the Chinese. But longer term, you have this very autocratic power, and its global reach and influence are magnified, and maybe it affects many more things than we think. So the relative status of autocracy goes up, and that's indirectly due to the internet. Because it used to be way back when countries that were poor, it was much harder for them to become rich faster. Japan did it, South Korea was starting to do it, but now there are all these different channels.
I
So
would,
like the relative influence of what you might call Western European ideas, it's dwindling very rapidly. And maybe America itself needs that more than it realizes. Like
mm,
that's one of the roots of our own liberalism. And without that, we drift into being some kind of new world country that's a bit more like the neighbors to the south in terms of corruption and the European roots, the immigrants we take in, it dwindles and gets somewhat lost. And then we become not the next Brazil, but more in that direction.
mm. And also, I mean, I love Patrick, but they are products of a previous time, right? Like, and I am myself, my company, Evie, like we come from this very specific period in intellectual history and technological history where some of these kind of cultural or some of this blending could take place. And we hang out in these group chats all day. Twitter's status completely changes, and I so often wonder, like, would I still make it without, like, in the group chats? No, because you have to be an insider to get into it. I mean, the whole idea of Twitter, and this is Twitter in a very kind of generic Tocquevillian, information sharing sense, was that you don't have to be anybody. Like, I went on Twitter in 2018 because I had nothing. I had lost everything. And I thought, okay, I woke up one day and I thought, I don't care. Like, one thing I have is myself. But it's very kind of like Agambennian, down to the physical reality of yourself. I can go and just say things and we'll see what happens. Then what happened is that 4 months later, I had venture funding for a company that suddenly now existed. And I was moving to a different country. Like, it's just like you open this thing, and if you're good or ready, or if you have what people want in that moment, then it's going to happen very fast.
Yes.
Right? Like this podcast, like I waited for a year, and then it happened in 2 days, and then I haven't slept in 2 days. It's amazing. Be ready, guys. It's good. But I don't know if that's possible right now. Like if I went on and tried to like read, first of all, or you and a lot of other people who were in a specific configuration at the time are in completely different like stages of your lives, in your organizations, your attention spans. But is that hunger still there in the publics? Or do you
I
have
think it
like,
is. Now, it may be more oral culture and less written culture. So TikTok, YouTube, different ways of talking, and even a lot of WhatsApp chats. When you look at how you write, you're writing the way you speak more than you're writing the way you write. So this may be another part of the current weirdness, that written culture is declining more rapidly than we might have expected. And with that, all these European Enlightenment foundations dwindle as well. And we're left floating in the air. We don't really know what the new foundations are. There's not an enlightenment, but what is there? A lot of people say crazy things, and it just keeps on going on. The number of crazy things said multiplies. The number of dopes out there keeps on growing. It seems to me that's where we're at. But I think there's still opportunity.
it's a specific kind of abundance that's also happening on the level of the dopes? But you think,
Yeah,
yeah, you and Dwarkesh both say that AI has kind of John Stuart Mill's enlightenment values
it
and
does. It's great.
will
It's
help
the
us
it's the
in the
last bastion. The beast of the machine is where it remains so strong.
yeah.
It can tell you anything about the Enlightenment, and it's usually correct. And it will depends how you're asking or prompting it, but typically it's a moderating influence, and it will remind you of reality and give you pretty objective answers. So that's one of my hopes, that the soft power of the main AI systems goes up somewhat. I think it will.
In what way would a user of, say, GPT-5 become more enlightened? Is it the nuances that they are presented with?
Nuances, alternate points of view. If you just ask it questions like, oh, how well did the COVID vaccines work? You will get essentially a correct answer. Uh, there are ways you can manipulate it into making you more extreme, but it's not its natural tendency to push you toward extremism. Its natural tendency is to push you actually toward the center. I'm not saying the center view is always correct, but on net, that's a very healthy influence.
And who is the person who understands that best beside you and Dwarkesh? Are there philosophers working on this? I need to get them on InTranslate.
Oh, no one comes to mind, but there certainly are likely to be people I don't know about. And you've had a bunch of philosophers on lately, right?
Maybe we should ask GPT-5 who are the best philosophers about you.
Yeah, and it will know.
Here are some preferences. That's wonderful. The other thing that I was so interested in the Rosen podcast, because obviously you produced a lot of these autobiographical pieces, and they are kind of like, I mean, your books are, full of these stories as well. And then to Rosen and myself, basically the same thing stood out so strongly, which is this one moment when you say, that as a chess player, you didn't mind losing. And
Not very much.
I was so
I didn't
surprised.
prefer losing, but the top players I've met, like Anand or Magnus Carlsen
Yeah.
or Kasparov, they truly hate losing with every bone in their
Yeah.
body. They do not approach it philosophically. They can become very miserable as a result, and that's very far from my attitudes.
Yeah.
And it shaped my life in a significant way.
I was so surprised. I was like, what? But actually, what in like a Maggie Smith high RP? Like, what? This never occurred to me that losing can be approached philosophically.
And I think always keeping my equanimity has been good for me getting these compound returns over long periods of time. But if you're doing a thing like chess or math or sports that really favors the young, you don't have all those decades of compound returns. You've got to motivate yourself to the maximum extent right now. And then hating losing is super useful. But those are not the things I've done.
Well, I
But the people who hate losing should do things that are youth weighted, and the people who have equanimity should do things that are, maturity and age weighted with compounding returns.
Do they still work? Like, I'm definitely a compound returns kind of person. Like, don't know why, but like, I think like, oh, if I just do this for a long time and I push this button for a long time in my kitchen, in my pajamas, something would happen. And something usually happens. But it seems to me that at least my Gen Z friends are absolutely not believers in this at all. Like, they don't see, like, they don't even envision a kind of timeline. Do they still work? Like, can we go to young people and still tell them that compound returns will happen? Just keep on going?
Well, in a world without advanced AI, it ought to keep on working. I think it's a genuinely open question. Are we seeing a break in compounding returns? Because AI will so change the mix of skills you need to do well. I'm not sure there's that break, but it's at least possible there is. And that would be a big part of its fundamental disruption. I once asked Jack Clark, like, what's the hardest age to be for dealing with the AI transition? I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I said 40.
Oh,
You're
no.
about 40, right? So you can't just keep doing the same thing for another 30 years, is my guess.
Yeah.
And it will test your adaptation.
I loved it. But for me, it was like, oh no, I'm 40 and it's finally happening. I can't believe I had to wait so much for this. I wanted this my whole life. Finally, I can just like find out about everything. It's amazing. That's so interesting. Oh yeah, Jack Clark from OpenAI. OpenAI.
Anthropic.
Anthropic. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know Jack. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I will look that up. Dan Wang did this wonderful book event a couple of days ago. Our friend Dan, writer of Breakneck. And during the conversation, this idea came up. Obviously, he's investigating through a different prisms what makes China and America so similar to one another. Rohit Krishnan on this podcast said that America and India were so similar, so there seems to be some disagreement there. But what came up was that despite the vast differences between the Chinese mentality and the American one, the common kind of contradictions that came up were that Chinese individuals seem to be more materialist in their choices, in their worldview, but nevertheless, the country is often run by very philosophical people, whereas in America, the individuals seem to be very idealistic and philosophical, but the leadership isn't. But the two things, the one thing that connects these two places is that nevertheless, these are the two empires in the world today that have a vision of the future, or that can even think about a future. And as a European who also, I lived in multiple European countries, so have experienced North, South, West, East. Truly, one weird thing about Europe is there is no future. I mean, that's why I left. Like, why would I want to just like mope around here and then wait and die? Like, that sounds terrible. Like, and individuals who have a kind of inclination towards visualizing a future, they're outnumbered, right? So you feel this constant, like, you're under siege in a way, and you need to like save your energy and put your talent somewhere where that can actually go somewhere. But that always makes me ask myself, like, why is there a future in America? Like, what makes Americans, I want to learn this, or I want to understand why I have it, even though I'm not American. Is this some kind of birth defect that you're born this way and then in a country it perpetuates? Is it in the water? Is it taught to you? Was it taught to you in New Jersey when you were growing up? How does it form in an individual?
It was taught to me in New Jersey when I was growing up. And we have these weird practices, like we call it the World Series in baseball, when of course it's obviously not. And maybe the American teams are the best. I don't even know.
But the World
We
Series
don't-
gets only played here, right?
Yeah, it's not even a question. You don't have to establish that empirically. And I think a key part of this is Americans do not pay that much heed to a lot of other people. So if someone has a mental illness, you don't come along and deal with them at all. You just let it fester. So that's one reason why I say we have bad things such as a lot of school shootings. But your actual freedom to be different is pretty high. And there's many different states, different climates, all sorts of choices you can make. And people won't bug you that much. America, to me, does not seem at all like India. What's striking to me about America and China is that when Chinese come here, they become Americans very quickly. You could say a lot of them are better Americans than the Americans by a lot of standards. When Americans go to China, they can never become Chinese. And that's the most fundamental difference. So if you look at the movement one way, the countries seem very similar. If you look at it the other way, they seem very different. And that's a pretty fundamental asymmetry. So I mostly agree with what Dan says in his book, but that's a big, big difference.
Hmm. I
They cannot swallow us. We can swallow them.
Yeah, you can't move to France and become French. Even your children will not count as French.
But
Yeah.
you can do that a bit more than you can become Chinese. You will never be Chinese. If your kids grow up speaking French, have the right accent, well, they might end up looking sort of French, depending where you're from. There are different ways you could bluff it. But in China, no. And just the physical, how people look, it matters more than a lot of us want to admit. But they physically look more alike each other than, say, Europeans or North Americans do. And I think that's highly significant.
One of the most liberating things about living here, and it took me a while to figure out after, I mean, I first came here in 2019, I was 35. It's not, everything here hit me as an adult. So it's much more, there's much more judgment involved, I think, than when you come here younger. And one thing that, first of all, I always felt so light, like something heavy that is there everywhere else is not present here. And I was like, what is that? And to me, there are two things. One, kind of like positive, negative freedoms. One is definitely that I don't have to explain myself in a
You mean here or there?
Yeah, no, here in America. Like, I never feel like, what do you do? Oh, I run this company where it's like people kind of like host events and make money. Cool. and across the board, like, it's not a class thing. And then the other person will also tell me what they are building, and great, and we can become friends. I love this. This would never happen anywhere in Europe. There would be a million follow-up questions. I would have to produce my tax return, the family tree of my parents or something to decide what gives me permission. Why did I decide? What does that mean about the other person that I could decide this, right? Like the whole kind of matrix is shifting, and I never feel this here. And the other thing that is very interesting and took me much longer to figure out because it's so counterintuitive, I think, for everybody else, is that individual will is sacrosanct. Like I'm not used to like, I don't know, eating something and not liking eggplants. And then people are like, cool. And then you just don't get eggplants. Like, I know this sounds extremely simple, but the fact that I can have a preference about extremely basic things. And you would think that it is to some degree gendered, that you have to be a little bit, you have to appear a little bit more peaceable, maybe. But it's something about how, like, one of my experiences growing up, and I'm very strong-willed, so it was a constant kind of like weird push with the world from which I actually just hid after a while. I was like, you guys figure this out, I will just be reading, is that you say, I don't know, I don't like Jurassic Park. Oh, you're stupid, you like it. And you're like, and they're completely like, Ayla recently wrote about this weird thing. She grew up in this extreme circumstance with religious fundamentalist parents constantly trying to break her will. And I'm like, yeah, but like in Europe, you're constant, like your will is against this constant stressor. And a lot of people just bend. And I think if you don't bend, you just have to leave. Because I was like, oh my God, like you can try, like it's just not going to happen. But these little things that somebody would take it into account, what I want to eat, is like complete novelty for me. And I think this is somehow not, maybe it's too tragic to think about how rare this is in the world, but I don't see much literature about this.
Yeah, I think a related significant feature of the United States is you always have the option of living in New York. And there's not a comparable option in Western Europe.
I love it here.
Paris, London, they're great cities, but you don't have the freedom of sort of peer group and status hierarchy that you do in New York City. And it shapes the whole country that there's this option. In a way, in London and Paris, you're the most prisoner of those countries. And here in New York, you can easily choose to be the least prisoner and get away with it. And then Los Angeles did its own version of that. So you could say we have two cities where that holds. And that's remarkable. It's shaped the whole country.
How is DC?
Oh, it's awful. I mean, there's only one status hierarchy. It's gross. It's boring. Who is it said? It's like Hollywood for ugly people, or that's unfair. But it's also true, right?
DC, I always marvel at how chic the women are, and like everybody's very comme il faut, but maybe that's a bad sign.
No, I don't see chic people around here. I've lived here most of my life. I don't think it's chic at all. I think people are conservative dressers in an acceptable but rarely interesting way.
Maybe that's what I like. I don't know.
Well, it's fine. It's easy for me as someone who's not a dresser-upper. You can always just put on your, navy jacket and it's okay.
Yeah.
Whereas in New York, there's always someone much better dressed than you are.
I'm not even trying. I'm just in my pajamas all day. It's just fine. Oh, that remains a mystery for me because I never wanted to move to New York. I was like, what? Yeah, of course, New York is another single Jewish girl who wants to work in culture. Like, that's not going to happen. And then I came and, it was just like I felt so much at home. This is the first place after Budapest where I feel like I'm myself. And I hear all these stories from other Americans about how stressful this is. And I'm like, it's not stressful, at least for me at all. I think it takes, maybe if I lived in Midtown and not with the 90-year-old darling ladies and diners where people have lunches at 11:15 in the morning, I would feel more stressed. But up here, it's all good.
In New York, there's this funny kind of competition in New York. There's always someone richer than you are, better looking than you are, knows more about a topic than you do. And that way, New York, I think, is also unique. No matter what you do, you can never really feel you're the best at it.
Perhaps.
And if you're waiting in line somewhere, which is pretty common in New York, the chance that it's worth talking to the people next to you in line is remarkably high. I suspect the highest in the world.
Yep.
And that's neat.
Have you ever been tempted to move here?
No. Just physically living there is too difficult for me. and I make up for it by a lot of trips to New York and just travel to other places. I worry that New Yorkers don't travel enough because they have this illusion that the world comes to them. And a lot of them are actually quite provincial. And I mean the quote unquote well-traveled ones. I think they get less from their travel and they don't have the best attitude toward travel overall. They always feel a bit they should be back in New York because there's something amazing going on. And they're not wrong. That's the funny thing. But it's a bad attitude to have nonetheless.
I don't know, for me, it was like, I always wanted to be in a place where I only don't go out if I don't want to. So it's kind of up to me. And then I'm just home all the time and never go out. So apparently I want to live in a party city and just stay at home with my books. This is also a type of person. But I need to know that if I wanted to, there would be something to see or watch or hear outside.
But that's part of my problem. Home in New York City, especially Manhattan, it's never quite that pleasant. There's not that much space. And then going out is never quite that pleasant. Well, there's not that much space. There's a line. There's the weather, or you don't see the sun, or there's the exhaust. There's some noise. So there are never, not never, but not so many moments of truly resting and refreshing. And it wears one down a bit.
Yeah, I avoid lines. I don't. If somebody's queuing up for something, I immediately assume that the thing is terrible. It went viral on TikTok, and I should not touch that. And you just have to be clever. I feel like I really disliked London and really disliked living there. There was a very bad fit for me, but it does equip you with some super smarts, I think, for the world at least. Many years ago, you implanted this thing in my brain, and I've been thinking about it ever since. You kind of incepted it into my mind, that America is for well-adjusted weirdos.
I think that's right.
What
You
does
can be
that
so
mean?
productive as a well-adjusted
Tell
weirdo
us
here.
about well-adjusted. Is that an oxymoron, first of all?
No, I think a lot of weirdos are well-adjusted. And America lets you be weird, and it rewards your well-adjustedness because it can pay you a lot if you're good at something. And you can just have both. And there's just not these major obstacles in the way. And if you're well adjusted, you can work well with quite a few other people. And the number and talent of other people here to work with is very high. And people will entertain the notion of working with you much more than in the other wonderful parts of the world. That's a big advantage also. So many people will consider working with you here or funding you or helping you, supporting you. I don't know of any parallel anywhere else to that.
A lot of people these days want to be seen as weirdos. There are even famous examples like SBF, who learned how to act as one, right? To adopt the hair and the dirty t-shirt and the quirks. I always think that he's a little bit like the copycats of Byron. When people started equating romantic, poetic talent with certain forms of dressing and speaking. And to me, you're a weirdo. You're a normie if normies accept you as one. And it's not really up for choice. And there's an easy way for find out for people whether they are normies or weirdos. How does one know if one is well adjusted?
Well, you can measure your level of neuroticism. There's some papers that show just by asking yourself your level of neuroticism, you can estimate it fairly accurately. Like it correlates with what other people say about you more closely than you might think. For a start, but I would say in today's world, also try asking GPT, write the prompt correctly with some detail. And I think it can probably tell you that also.
Oh, that's
Just how neurotic I am and, flesh out the prompt a bit. But if you spend some time with it or with Claude, I don't see how it wouldn't know.
But you think that some artistic forms of talent do need high neuroticism, right?
Of course, not need is maybe too strong a word, but they favor it.
Mm.
So a lot of popular music, the top creators have been highly neurotic. Bob Dylan, John Lennon. But someone like Mick Jagger seems actually oddly well-adjusted. Paul McCartney, pretty well-adjusted. So there's both. Obviously, Van Gogh, many famous painters, literally can be crazy, right?
I recently redid my test, the Big Five, because Olga Kazan from The Atlantic came on Interact, which is a book about whether people can change their personalities. And I was like, okay, I'm going to like see what happened. The last time I did it was before I started Interact. And now 6 years on, it's like completely different. And the neuroticism going down is, I think, one weird thing that happens when you run an organization, that you just become a little bit more stoic and like, it's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. I recommend to everybody, you just start a venture funded company or have 10 kids and your neuroticism will be over. But you also talk about this really interesting, crossing the threshold, going from inside to outside. One way to prompt oneself, obviously, is keeping it interesting. But you also, with Daniel, talk about your like different emphases that come from your personalities between the obsession and the competition. And again, to go back to your chess example, you say that you are less competitive and more obsessive, whereas he, the marathon runner, is the competitive one. Is this another thing that's shifting throughout life? Can we, like, should I don't think I have to increase my obsessions, but like for people who feel that they are not obsessed enough, is this something that should we become more obsessed? I feel like we need to increase some negative traits actually in the population to get more talent and more crosser of borders.
It hasn't shifted for me. Past some pretty young age, I don't think it shifts that much. And if you're not already obsessive, that's fine. But why would you want to be? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I think you can be quite happy and obsessive, but it's only value because you're obsessed with the thing you're obsessive about. Otherwise, just let it go.
How do we know that obsessions pay out, or the stubborn attachments?
Well, you become very good at some things because you keep on doing them and learning about them. So obsessive people, when combined with other qualities, they can be very successful. And that's good for your status and your happiness, right? That's basic social science.
And maybe that's also, maybe in this sense, for me, there's a higher moral quality to obsessiveness than to competition. First of all, because you will commit fewer bad things. I think as an obsessive, it's more like a lonely, self-focused thing. But also, yeah, I think it's better for a team if there are very, very obsessive people in it, that it's just the competition. Although I don't know how. Like, I also do my own mentoring project. I have a team. There are all these hosts and Interact. And somehow I feel like it's much easier to help a competitive person than to help an obsessive, because obsession is so much its own reward in some weird way. How should we treat obsessive people? I count myself among them in a group.
Send them books, music, like feed their habit. The competitive people, they have a big advantage in business because you need to be very focused on your customers, which means beating out the competition. And if you're just obsessive, you might iterate on some processes that are not that important for winning, in the sector. So competitiveness has very serious, strong uses also. But if you're a scientist, maybe being obsessive is more valuable because societally, we don't care who discovers the thing first. We just wanted a bunch of people working very hard to discover it.
In First of all, I loved Goats so much now that I actually like had more time to read it. Your 2023 book that I had read in 20, I think you did the Internet song about it in December 2023. I remember this because I was in Berlin waiting at the embassy for my O1 visa, which is like a perfect match. And I mean, I really recommend this book to everybody. It's hilarious, first of all. It's extremely witty, insanely beautifully researched, and you learn so much fun stuff about these people. Who is the most obsessive? So you go through so many of these people, Mill, Malthus, Hayek, Keynes. Who was the most obsessive, like, or competitive? Like, how do they fare on this dichotomy?
It's hard to tell because they're some of the most obsessive people I've ever studied. You don't become one of the seven greatest economists of all time without being obsessive.
It's not something that will happen to you while you're being chill, right? It's not.
Yes. Now, I think Adam Smith was the least competitive of the group. He lived with his mother for a long time. He worked on his books for decades, only traveled a bit to France, London. So he seems obsessive and not very competitive. I suspect the most competitive was Keynes, who always was maneuvering in politics, diplomacy, influencing the government, being appointed to help design Bretton Woods. You have to be very competitive to get into those slots to begin with. So those would be my picks for most and least competitive.
And you also have this beautiful kind of spectrum for them in terms of like outsider, insider, and who have your what to me seems like your ambition to kind of be both, right?
Keynes was the consummate
Yeah.
insider. Most of the others are outsiders. They may become insiders to some extent, but they're by nature outsiders.
Good.
Just like, Smith being from Scotland rather than England and London, Cambridge, Oxford, which was then the center. Uh, Hayek is from Vienna, which is central, but he's an Austrian economist. He's weird. He has a law degree. He ends up stuck at University of Chicago, not always having much impact for many years. So, yeah, a lot of outsiders on the list. Malthus is teaching, servants of the East India Company, which is a weird job to have for a top economist.
Good.
I think Milton Friedman, he started as an outsider, but he became, kind of mainstream establishment, and he fit into being an insider quite well. I don't think he intrinsically was the temperament of an outsider, even though he started off that way.
I think Arrow is the only person that you call an actual genius in this book, which is a very competitive field already to be there. But it's I had this sense that you saw him as too much of an insider to be the GOAT. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's one reason. Yeah. He might be the highest IQ of all the economists, but he got very wrapped up in mathematical thinking, and maybe that made him somewhat less relevant for a number of real-world problems. He was a bit too entranced by the mathematics of some of it. Unlike Keynes, who didn't really like math, and he didn't like math and economics, and that's a flaw of its own kind, but it kept him highly relevant.
My favorite sentence, or it's one sentence in the book, is I don't view Keynes primarily as an economist. Rather, I see him as a British aesthete rationalist who did economics in his spare time. And fortunately, he had a lot of spare time.
Yes. And I also say in the book, he's the one I'd most want to hang around.
I think we all do. He would be wonderful at intellect as well. One other thing that really stood out to me, and I never really thought about this, and to me, that's maybe the highest praise that, at least from you, I can imagine somebody being given. You call John Stuart Mill a civilizationist. Is that the word? Civilizationist.
That's right. Yes.
What does that mean? And do you see yourself as such?
I do. I almost was going to write a book about civilizationalism as a doctrine. So it's like an organic Hegelianism, but classically liberal, rather than leaning toward autocracy or conservative right views. And Mill was profound. He was humane. He understood there was this thing, civilization, that had to be protected and nourished. And it was at the center of his thought in a way that, the others had some handle on, but he saw it and wrote about it most profoundly. And you see it also in his book reviews. If you read Mill writing on Guizot, the French historian, or writing on Tocqueville, just his sense of this underlying but also overarching civilization that was out there in the world. And he was one of the stewards of it. That had a big impact on me. And I like to think I'm doing my own small part in that.
I think you are, but I always wonder, civilization to what? What is civilization then?
I think it's fine to regard it as an end in and of itself. It supports human well-being. It produces beautiful things. It gives people opportunity and some degree of autonomy and the ability to choose and have all these diverse, different, wonderful paths. And maybe you can't prove it's better than the alternative, but it's as good a starting point as you're going to find.
My favorite poem is Audun's Voltaire at Terni, where Voltaire is in exile and his big exclamation is civilize. And
yes.
He would go into exile than to give up on that.
Now, there's a rather complicated history for the word. because so frequently it's been used to treat other, often weaker peoples badly. So one has to ask some serious questions. Is that intrinsic in the notion, or is it something that was merely a corruption of the notion? And I don't think the answer there is so simple. So it needs a lot of self-scrutiny, and the people on the left who a bit shove this down our throats, but I think they're more correct than not correct in forcing us to pay heed to those questions.
And you do write a lot about some of these economists' quite drastic views on colonization and India. I think almost all relevant individuals have their own little chapters about this. Another thing to kind of like go back to Arrow being a genius, but maybe too much of an insider, and the kind of dubious effects of some of these old-fashioned ways of evaluating people, whether that's neuroticism or IQ, in the Talent book, and I think also in the Daniel Gross podcast, where you famously called Lee Harvey Oswald the unicorn of the KGB. You discuss how IQ is not the most important thing, and that there is like an entire chapter about why in some cases yes, but then there are also these other things that complicate the picture. Whereas more recently, I watched this video of your interview with Dwarkesh Patel at last year's Progress Conference, and you go at it in a much more simple way. You say that IQ is overrated. What the world is in greater need of is courage. What does that mean? And for me, that's kind of what I would see behind the crossing of the different boundaries. Is that so, or can we just bravely stay put?
And keep in mind, I'm speaking to different audiences. So if you're out in the Bay Area, you really need to tell people IQ is overrated. You probably don't need to tell them that in rural Pennsylvania. Maybe you need to tell them IQ is a wee bit underrated. So I hope it's overall a consistent message. But the idea of courage, that you're daring to do something different, which, by the way, the Bay Area is great at. I would not fault it at all on that count. But a lot of Europe, Western Europe in particular, is not. It's quite a scarce quality. And bureaucracies, I think it's more and more rare. It's just harder to implement because there are more rules and procedures. And say politicians who are willing to incur not being reelected or even hatred from their constituents. That seems rarer than it used to be. I'm not sure why. And that's a serious problem today. People who will stand up for things knowing it may not be good for them, but in fact, they can't actually be harmed. They have a lot of money to begin with, or they can fall back into a higher paying job as a lawyer or whatever, and yet they're still cowards. People in DC who ought to speak up on different issues, I genuinely don't grasp what holds them back. And we see a bit of it, but I think far less than what we need of it.
In Brussels, this is why I left Brussels earlier than I expected. It's just, you don't understand what holds people back. And I'm not always good at modeling their view of the world. And you ask them, and it's not always obvious.
And there's always someone who will tell you you can't do a certain thing. And maybe that's healthy, that there's someone there to say it. But the courage to go ahead and try it anyway.
And you can, I think for me and my experience, I grew up being told what I can't do all the time, right? And then you just build this kind of black market in your life, like a second life, and then you just like do those things in secret. And for me, that was very late in my early 30s when my secret life became my open life. And then people can kind of just do this. This is what Zena Hitz's beautiful book, Lost in Thought, is about, that you can like develop an intellectual praxis for yourself. It's, if somebody tells you can't do something, just don't do it in front of them, right?
And New York is great for this. It's one of the places where people are least likely to tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
Better in a way than the Bay Area. The Bay Area people, they won't tell you that in tech. But if you say something about like art or music, they might just think you're weird. They don't even know to tell you not to do it, but it hasn't even registered what you might be doing. But New York is really quite open in these regards.
Yeah, there are invisible cities in this city as well. And I think it takes a special kind of talent to find your invisible cities and not tell anybody. Like not even on the internet, not everything has to be out in the open. And I think, Nadia Asprovova's beautiful book is kind of about this. Like you can have a group chat, you can have a book club in your home. Not everything has to go on your resume, and you can just wait until some of these ideas develop. And there's something courageous about that. To close our podcast, I would like to have a new GOAT list, but about courage. Who are the most courageous people that young people listening to this podcast or watching us, or people who are restarting their lives? Who should they look for? If not for IQ, then just this kind of courage that you try to sell, I think probably successfully with Dorkesh to the Silicon Valley audience.
Well, there's so many people in the recent history of Eastern Europe. You would have greater command over the list than I would, but it's quite a large number. What has personal meaning to me is all the people in Mexico who work in the judiciary or as journalists or as mayors, and they are murdered at remarkably high rates, and they keep on doing it. And I feel eventually their cause will win. They're not glorified that much. It's not like the Dalai Lama where they're held up and worshipped and everyone comes to see them. And they end up dead, or their families even are dead. But they believe in Mexico and that Mexico can become a better nation. And so many of the murders in Mexico are of these people who take a stand against extreme odds. And they would be very high on my list. And the fact that hardly any of us could name a single one of them makes it all the more glorious and important what they do.
And it makes it all the worse when somebody does not have those prices to potentially pay for speaking up and they still don't.
And we should think about them if we're ever wondering, well, should I do something here? Should I speak up? What will happen to me? Think about Mexican mayors, journalists, and judges and what so many of them have done with, in general, way fewer resources than what North Americans would have. And not obviously a super optimistic scenario in front of them, not necessarily. And they do it in great numbers and receive relatively little credit.
You do speak up a lot. I mean, this recently against some new plans by the current administration. Do you experience any pushback, or are there any prices that you have to pay?
No, it doesn't take any courage from me at all. I mean, what takes a little bit of courage from me is when I will sometimes defend things Trump has done.
Yeah.
And I get much more pushback. Now, I think there's been more bad than good, but some of the good is very good. And it's speaking up for that when I'm not on board the general program, but I want to make some points. It's nothing remotely close to the truly courageous people, but that's when I catch more flack.
Or like the Scott Alexander thing. I mean, that's kind of like a misreading intention.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So if I say, well, the Trump AI policy, so far it's been quite good, which I do think, people get very mad. You're not supposed to say anything other than what's negative, because the negatives are very high. But you're supposed to take a side and push for that side to win. I'm very against that way of writing or thinking. I'm much more interested in a kind of selfish way of trying to say new things that other people are not saying, even if it doesn't always favor like the side I want to win. And you can get in trouble sometimes doing that.
Yeah. Being neutral is not a rising in status right now in your system, right?
Yeah, and I'm not really neutral. Like I'm taking different sides, but I'm just not calculating which side do I want to win and jumping on that bandwagon. It's the selfish, here's what I want to say, because it's bugging me that no one else is saying it. And it is a selfish motivation. So if people want to call me that, like, okay, I will accept that brickbat, but at the same time, it's part of my obsession and I'm not going to give it up.
Is it true that you don't vote, or is that some fanfic?
I think if you vote, you can too easily become stupider. You treat it like a sports team that you're rooting for or against. So I've tried to exercise influence in different ways other than voting.
What does it say about your views on democracy? I mean, we encourage people to vote and in your system to get more stupid.
Democracy's great. I would never want to live in a non-democratic society. But part of democracy is the freedom not to vote. And if I exercise that, that's one of my greatest privileges. And so often, I don't know for whom I should vote. Like people, they can be so convinced for whom they
You
should
have too
vote.
much information.
Like sometimes I do think I know, but a lot of times I'm like, this is not so easy. And you go back, you look at history, Like pick some very obscure president and
Yeah.
ask yourself, well, if Millard Fillmore hadn't won, how would it have been different? And the fact that you have no idea whatsoever, for better or worse, like you might have some sense of the next 8 years after Millard Fillmore, but how that would have played out by the 1890s, you've no idea. Right? You should take that a bit seriously too.
But that's an outsider position, right? I mean, you live, I mean,
Sure.
here DC, but you don't vote. Like, how much more could somebody express their abstaining from certain insider moves than by that?
Well, I write on all the topics that people vote about, and I'd rather give a subtler, more nuanced message than checking one box or the other, because I don't want to become stupider.
Hmm. Yeah, I like your post when you're like, I'm not going to write about this because I will end up stupider. Let's move on, and then people can go and read about that somewhere else. So I mean, we're a little bit over time, but thank you for staying with me. You write a lot and talk a lot about legacy as remembered by the AIs. I think about this a lot because I come from a small country and I speak this small, weird language, and I'm aware that at some point only the AIs will speak Hungarian. And every time I speak Hungarian with the AIs, I have this kind of bittersweet tint to it. Um, but I mean, your recent writing is kind of explicitly for the AIs. I feel personally offended by this, but good for the AIs. So will they see you as an insider or as an outsider, do you think? In 100 years, when somebody like runs this query with their neurons, what
The
will
AIs will think of me as an early insider because I've a bit been in league with them, even though I'm not like an insider right now. And you with Hungarian, you didn't even have cognates. I mean, that's something, right?
we apologize?
Well, it makes it more interesting, but outsiders don't understand any of it. I think like maybe hotel and taxi are similar words. That's about it.
Yeah, it's good to speak some alien language and always be in a conversation and know that kind of nobody has access to it. Thank you so much, Tyler.
See you next time, whenever that is.
All right. Take
Okay, bye.